What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown and this is Heresy Financial. It seems like a good time to do a video like this because increasingly I've been noticing a lot of you are commenting on my videos saying things like, hey, that's not true, that's incorrect. Even the other day, Peter Schiff commented on one of my videos saying what I said was not true. And technically, you're right. In fact, many times when I'm presenting information or an explanation in my videos, I say things that are technically incorrect, false. And so just to be perfectly transparent with you, I need to explain the way I explain things. And no, this is not a confession. I 110% stand behind the way I do things. Ready? Let's dive in. Have you ever been using a map and while you're using the map, you realize that it's technically wrong? The map is giving you incorrect information? Well, if you use Apple Maps, you likely encounter this every single time you open up the app. But if you use Google Maps, you probably rarely ever think about the fact, but maps are inherently incorrect. Just by the nature of what a map is a representation, or said another way, it's an explanation about reality. And by nature, the representation of what's real must be different in some way, otherwise it would just be the real thing. And a map that is identical in reality to the actual landscape you're trying to navigate across is useless because it would just be the landscape itself. So maps are usually different in size. The map is usually a lot smaller than the real landscape. It's usually different in color. Usually the map is going to be, green or brown or blue or something like that, whereas the actual landscape might be all sorts of different colors. It's going to be different in the fact that it's either going to be digital or printed on paper. It's going to be two-dimensional, whereas real landscapes are 3D. It's going to pick and choose which obstacles it shows you. It's going to overlay different things to communicate specific things about the reality, but it's by nature going to be incorrect in most things. And that is not a flaw of a map. That is actually precisely the thing which makes a map useful. Because if a map was identical to the landscape itself, it wouldn't be useful as a map. Your whole reason for needing a map is to distill the necessary information to communicate the reality to help you navigate point A to point B. My goal and what I do is I create maps. I create maps that help you get from point A to point B. My goal is not to drone on with every single nuance and to explain every disagreement about all the semantics of different words and the history and the origins of different words. I'm creating a map for you. And by definition, what that means is that parts of what I present will be technically incorrect, even though the general idea, the result, is accurate. A great example of this is when I say something like the Fed prints money. Technically, that is incorrect. They do not expand the money supply. The reality is the Federal Reserve funds large fiscal deficits that are in excess of what the federal government could borrow out of the economy after it taxes what it can out of the economy. Any excess borrowing that they need to do on top of that is funded by the Federal Reserve. It's called debt monetization. And so the federal government spends money into existence funded by the Federal Reserve's monetizing of the debt used to do that spending. But guess what? Even that is not technically correct. Even that is technically wrong because the Federal Reserve is not even legally allowed to monetize the debt, meaning the Federal Reserve can't loan money directly to the federal government. In fact, the federal government can only borrow out of the economy legally. And so when the federal government needs to borrow, they borrow primarily from banks. A treasury is created. That bank loans money to the government. And then at some point, arbitrarily, the bank just says, oh, I don't want this debt anymore. And so what they do is they go to the marketplace and they say, anybody want to buy this debt and have the government owe you money instead of me? Well, guess what? The Federal Reserve is the buyer, a big buyer in that marketplace. So they step in and they say, oh, we'd like to own some of that debt. We'll buy that debt from you. We'll give you cash. You give us that treasury. Now the federal government owes that money to us and you just have cash. And there's the implicit assumption that that bank is going to go turn around, do the exact same thing, loan that new cash to the government and repeat the process, sell that debt to the Federal Reserve. Guess what? That explanation does no better of a job to communicating to 99.9% of the people out there what they need to know, that the Federal Reserve expands the money supply. Technically, that's incorrect because there are multiple stages that has to go through to accomplish the effect, but the result is the same. 99.9% of the people don't care about the mechanics that cause that to happen. They just need to understand the Federal Reserve's job is to expand the money supply. It's what they do. And while that's technically incorrect, the result I'm describing is accurate. This is the only way that people learn things. In fact, I'm sure you remember when you were in science class as a high schooler, you probably learned about the makeup at the atomic level of an atom, and you were told electrons orbit the nucleus. Well, guess what? That's not technically correct. That's simply a model that was constructed for explanatory purposes to help people understand the mechanics of what's going on, that when you understand that, it gives you the ability to extrapolate that out and accurately understand the reactions between different molecules and atoms. But the explanation that electrons orbit a nucleus is actually wrong. Does that matter to anybody? No. It's right because it's useful, not right because it's technically correct. The other thing people like to argue about a lot is things that just come down to semantics, like the difference between money and currency. These are semantic disagreements that I'm completely uninterested in discussing, because despite the definition of the words changing throughout history, doesn't change the fact that modern vernacular is modern vernacular. It's what people use, and it's the way that people use words. If 100 years ago when people said inflation, they meant the expansion of the money supply, and a result of that was prices going up, but now when people say inflation, they're talking about prices going up, doesn't make a difference. It's not going to do you or me any good to use words in a way that they aren't used anymore. It's far better to communicate in a way that 99.9% of the people will understand, explaining the way things actually work rather than getting hung up on words and semantics. It's like the people who think the King James Version translation of the Bible is the only translation of the Bible that's accurate because it uses words like thou and shalt that are not words that are used by anyone anymore, and so its meaning is completely lost on people because you're using words from a different language of a bygone era. So on this channel, my goal is to help you understand how money really works. That means that I create maps, and maps by nature, by definition, are incorrect because you have to strip out parts of reality to distill the necessary components so that it's easier to digest and understand what is actually going on. And if that's not what you're looking for, there are plenty of fiat shills out there who will be happy to take up your time explaining to you why the Fed doesn't actually print money. And for those of you who have been around for a while, you know this already, but I sincerely appreciate you. And that's all. That's all I want to talk about today. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day.